In this recording, I'll explain a bit of history. I'm doing this because it's relevant for you to understand why the world is operating the way it does today. This man that you see over here is Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher, and also he had several other professions that are related to him being a philosopher. A philosopher is more than just someone that loves to think. He was also politically involved, socially involved. He was also a mathematician, a chemist, a cartographer. He had many professions also besides that, and he also traveled throughout the world. He went to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, and even to India. And maybe, there's not documented, maybe even went to East Asia, which also had mystery schools at the time. This man was a world traveler, and he really traveled out the world during his time when there were no airplanes, no Wi-Fi, no internet, no railways. You didn't even have the Roman roads back then, so traveling would take a lot of time. It was dangerous and filled with risks, but he did it. Okay, so I'm not being negative towards this man, but just understand this man. His teachings that he taught are the foundation for how Hollywood operates, how the music industry operates, and also how society in general in the Western world operates. Now, of course, later on we had the biblical influence, the biblical revelation that also influenced and shaped Western society. So what we have today is a mixture of biblical revelation, or what I call biblical Christianity, and Greek philosophy. And the Greek philosophy, for the most part, is founded upon the teachings of Pythagoras. Now, I'm not making this recording to praise and to give veneration to Pythagoras, no. I just want to explain, again, as mentioned, for the history. Pythagoras was born during the decline of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was the dominant world power at the time that even dominated Egypt. The power base was in Nineveh. That's also the town Jonah had to travel to preach the gospel. But the Assyrian Empire was later usurped by Babylonia. So the king of Babylon, through intermarriage with Assyrian nobles, he took over the Assyrian regime. They expanded the Assyrian regime until the Indus River in India, and also further into Turkey and towards Ethiopia. And Babylon was now the center. But still, everything else basically remained the same, but the power base was now in Babylon. And you need to understand, in ancient times, they didn't use the time phases we use today. To classify the time period, we call it the Assyrian Empire, then the name is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But for those people that lived at the time, it was just a power shift from Nineveh towards Babylon, but it was the same empire that was extended. Because the religion was almost the same, almost I say, the gospel almost the same, and also the economy was relatively the same. Okay, so during the time of the Babylonian Empire, that's when Babylon took over the Assyrian Empire, you can see on this map the extension of the Babylonian Empire after they extended the Assyrian influence. It was during this time that Pythagoras was born in Greece. Now, Greece at the time did not fall under the Babylonian Empire, neither under its jurisdiction. The Greeks were not a united nation, in the sense that you did not have a country called Achaia, for example. You did have a region called Achaia, which what they called Greece in their ancient language, but there was no nationhood among the Greeks. They spoke the same language, they were of the same ethnicity, yet the Greeks had city-states, and those city-states would often fight wars against one another also. And those city-states built colonies throughout the Mediterranean. The green in this map that you see over here are the Greek places. As you see, the south of Italy was Greek, all the way to Rome. Rome was also a Greek colony that later extended because Rome was modeled after the democratic ideals of Athens. As you see, the southeast of France and also the northeast of Spain was also Greek. Those regions were Greek regions. So if you wanted to go to Greece, you could choose between where you went to south of Italy or to Narbonensis, that's the southeast of France, what today call France, but also the Black Sea region was Greek. And you also had the Thracians and the Macedonians, and they became incorporated in the Greek world. So, and not only so in the Mediterranean, also in Britain, which they call Albion or Britannia. That's why there we get the word Britain from. You also had Greek towns over there. Even in ancient Norway, which was called Nerikos. From Nerikos you had Norvegia. That's why we call Norway today. Even in ancient Norway, you had Greek towns. So the Greeks were a people that sailed. They were powerful at sea. They were powerful in trade. And it's in trade that they established their economy. And it's in trade that, and let me say this, it's in trade they established their identity. Their economy became part of their identity because that's what the Greeks were known for. They traded. They went to far lands. So the Greeks had already had a huge network, but there was no unity amongst them. And Pythagoras, he was from an island in the Aegean Sea, somewhere above Crete. He received a good education by his parents, and he even went to Egypt to study. And he graduated in Egypt, because Egypt had what we would call academia, or the equivalent of what we today would call universities. Egypt had them. Also, Jerusalem had them. And understand this. During the Babylonian Empire, under King Nebuchadnezzar, a large sum of the Judean population was transported towards Babylon, into Mesopotamia, and the prophet Daniel, which they call Belteshazzar, I believe, because they changed their names into Babylonian names, but the prophet Daniel was a bit older than Pythagoras, and he became at a young age the head. He became the head of the mystery schools in ancient Babylon. With that, he became the head of the mystery schools in the ancient world, because Babylon became the world's power, which also dominated Egypt. So Daniel, he became the man, basically. I'm using colloquial speech here. So it's impossible for Pythagoras to have lived at the time and to have studied in Egypt, and he later also went to Mesopotamia, and he never heard of the prophet Daniel. Why I mention this? Because the prophet Daniel prophesied about the future, about the Antichrist, and also Daniel also prophesied that later there would be a Greek empire that would dominate world history until the end. You can read about it in Daniel, and in Daniel 11, at least that's a chapter we call it today. Daniel even prophesied that the land of Chittim will become dominant until the end. And what's the land of Chittim? Chittim is the land we today call Italy. So Daniel prophesied that the Greeks would have world dominance, and that the land of Chittim, that means Italy, would become the center of it. At that time that this was prophesied, Rome was just a tiny Greek town that was dependent and was basically begging other regions to trade with them. You had the Etruscan nation, that was also incorporated in the Greek world because, well, the Etruscs even though they had a marine, they needed the Greeks to trade because the Greeks were dominant on the Mediterranean. Now understand this. Pythagoras, he traveled around. Pythagoras also has learned about the prophet Daniel, because Daniel was promoted by King Nebuchadnezzar throughout the ancient world. So just imagine this. The Greeks, those white people, because, well, they are light-skinned, they are what I would call a black man's world, because those other empires, Egypt was black, they were brown-skinned people, the Babylonians were brown-skinned, so you didn't have many Caucasian people that had influence in that time. So now you have this white man. He was not an outcast, I would say, but he came from a nationality, from a background that was not that relevant. Yes, the Greeks were relevant for trade and for the black market, which already had a black market at the time, but he was just a Greek, if you get what I'm saying. So he learns by this wise man, this prophet from the Hebrews, that Italy is going to become dominant through the Greeks. This must have impacted this man, because the center of world politics was still in Asia, not in Europe, and at the time, to imagine Italy as a center of world politics and economics was something people would have told you you're out of your mind. Stop imagining, be realistic. That's what people would have told you. All right, so Pythagoras, he studied, he lived abroad, and around 530 BC, this was in the same time frame that the prophet Nehemiah, together with officials like Ezra, they began to reconstruct Jerusalem's wall and rebuild the temple. And understand this, the prophet Daniel spoke about the return of the Judean people to their homeland, which he also had from the prophet Jeremiah, that lived a little bit before the prophet Daniel. But Pythagoras also was living during the later times of Jeremiah's life, till Jeremiah was martyred. But all right, so when it happened that the Judeans did return to their capital and they had success despite resistance from governments to rebuild their city wall and rebuild their temple, this gave credibility to the prophecies of the prophet Daniel. Why am I mentioning this? It is because it's in Italy that Pythagoras founded his secret society. Pythagoras had knowledge about how music impacts the brain, how to make music and sounds with instruments in rhythms to attract people and to influence people. With Pythagoras, it was all about numbers. Numbers, numbers, numbers. You can say that he had a whole religion or a whole philosophy concerning numbers. From there you had Pythagorean numerology. You had the Chaldean numerology that was used throughout ancient times, but Pythagoras came up with his numerology. And this is what happened. When he founded his secret society in Italy, he had many rulers from Greek cities and also many people in business and people that are medical professionals. They all became part of his mystery school and they learned from him. It was a secret society, they had secret handshakes, they had oaths, they had to adhere to Pythagorean magic also. They had to swear that they would never speak about the secrets of about the teachings of the society on the threat of punishments. So Greeks around the Mediterranean learned from Pythagoras because now they had what I would call a white man someone like them who had his own mystery school. Instead of only learning from the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the people from India, people from the Far East, they now had their own to learn from. And Pythagoras became quite popular, not only in Italy. But here's the problem. This also led to envy. Because this is what you need to understand. When people feel excluded from something they perceive as beneficial, they become enraged, they become upset, and they act out. So the members of Pythagoras' secret society, some of them were discovered they were members of Pythagoras' club, and they were threatened, and their lives were in danger. There were also assaults on Pythagoras himself. And somewhere in 490 BC, Pythagoras died. And when he died, others continued his mystery school. And there were other Greek philosophers that followed Pythagoras' example. Not that they fully agreed with everything Pythagoras said, but they built onto it. And it was since then that the Greek community, the Greek world, had a common foundation. Because many Greek rulers already practiced the teachings of Pythagoras. Not only with music, also other ways how to manage a society, manage a population. Those people studied the brain and how human nature operates and how fear operates, so they had quite some knowledge. And they were also trained in the understanding of the pharaohs. So there weren't just a few crazy people forming some secret society to think there's something. Those were people that had insight and they had worldly power. Later, during the time that Pythagoras was doing this, you had the Medo-Persian Empire. And what I want to say is later the Greeks were threatened by the Medo-Persians because the Medo-Persians already conquered a part of Europe near what today call Bulgaria. And they were threatening to incorporate the whole of Greece. That means Sparta, Athens, Corinth, and Thessalonica, and all those other Greek cities. So this became a threat to the Greek-speaking world and to what the Greeks had established and built up since Pythagoras. But from Macedonia was incorporated in the Greek world. They also used Greek and as a language also, in international politics. And the king of Macedonia, he, through the aid of the Greek philosophers, he managed to incorporate Greece into his kingdom. So he was both the king of Macedonia and king of Greece. It was for the first time that Greece was a nation. But that also meant that all the overseas Greek colonies also became part of the Greek nation. So you already had what I would say a so-called Greek empire at the time, even though it was quite informal. The son of Philip of Macedon, his so-called son, but I won't go too much into it, Alexander. They call him Alexander the Great, but I'd prefer to call him just Alexander of Macedonia, or Alexander the Greek. He founded the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire was basically the Medo-Persian Empire conquered, extended into Asia and India, and also the Greek colonies around the Mediterranean. Also the Greek colonies in Britain and Norway, they all became part of the Greek Empire. Well, Alexander died after a very short period of reigning, but at this time, Greek became the world system. Ancient Greek language became the language in commerce. It became the language in politics. Greek was now being taught to the natives that were conquered by Alexander. So now it was Greece that basically rules the world. Before Alexander died, the agreement was that after his death, the empire would be divided into four amongst his four generals. While this happened, I'm not going too much into the history from then because it became a mess. Because there were some Macedonians and Greeks that went to Asia and established their own Greek countries. They exploited the situation. And the four generals that took over parts of the Greek Empire, it was for the majority the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom. You see that in the Seleucid kingdom is in yellow, the Ptolemaic kingdom is in blue. It was those kingdoms that came out of the Greek Empire that were the most dominant. And from that, the Ptolemaic kingdom, which encompassed Egypt, parts of Libya, Cyprus, and parts of Turkey, and Palestine, that was the most dominant, together with Rome. The Roman Republic at this time had extended and had conquered most of Italy. And shortly afterwards, other parts of the Mediterranean joined the Roman Republic. And the Roman Empire grew and grew. I don't say the Roman Republic was not an empire yet. Later, the Roman Republic came into conflict with the Ptolemaic kingdom, and after a battle on sea, the Ptolemaic kingdom became incorporated in the Roman Republic. And shortly afterwards, the Roman Empire was established. And the Seleucid kingdom, that kingdom fell apart. The half of it went to the Roman Republic, which was now the Roman Empire, and the other half became the Parthian Empire. And you still had those tiny Greek kingdoms that were still throughout Asia and Central Asia and India. So when the Roman Empire was established, its borders went till, I would say, the Euphrates, but its actual dominance directly went till India, because the Parthian Empire was a leftover from the Seleucid kingdom that was defeated by Rome. So they were quite weak. They weren't that powerful. And all those other Greek nations that were established throughout Asia and India, they were dependent upon the Seleucid kingdom that was just defeated, so they became dependent upon the Roman world. So this happened around the 1st century BC, and since then, Rome, that former Greek colony in the center of Italy, had become the center of world politics, economics, and culture. The Greek Empire became the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire was the same Greek Empire but extended and renewed. So that's when also the teachings of Pythagoras and those other Greek philosophers became dominant throughout the world. Because the Romans were quite fond of Pythagoras and the Greek philosophers. And because the Romans were Greeks, the Latin people were Greeks. They knew that about themselves. So Greek remained the spoken language throughout the Roman world, even though Latin was the language in which they corresponded with one another. The map you see here is around 1 AD, the beginning of the 1st century, according to the Roman calendar, which is the Gregorian calendar that we use today. The dominant world empire was Rome. As mentioned, the Parthian Empire was also large, but it was very weak and economically dependent upon Rome. So you can see it as an informal extension of Rome. And you also had those Greek kingdoms in Central Asia and India. And then you had the Han Chinese Empire. So you had the Han Chinese Empire, also the Kushan Empire, a small empire that was growing at the time, and you had Rome. And the Han Chinese Empire was also not that stable because it later fell apart during the Roman era. The era of the Roman Empire, it fell apart in 2 and sometimes 3 parts. So this was the world at the time. The influence and dominance of Rome grew also into Scandinavia, also because they dropped so many people from the Alpine regions into Norway. But why am I mentioning all of this? Is so that you will understand how the Western world is still dominant, how it came into being. The teachings of the Greek philosophers, to begin with Pythagoras, are the foundation of Western thought. And they're also the foundation of politics, economics, of the education system, of the entertainment industry. As I mentioned before, Hollywood often uses the methods of Pythagoras. That's why Hollywood often uses the same concept, the same storyline over and over again, and they keep getting so many views because they're using Pythagorean magic. Also in groups like Freemasonry, Pythagoras is very relevant. But I'm not making this video to talk about secret societies as much. I wanted to make this video for you to understand what has formed the world you're living in. If you had math in high school, like most of us had, you've learned about some of Pythagoras' teachings because they're used in geometry. Things as sacred geometry, which came from Egypt, were also taught by Pythagoras, and they're used in buildings today, and it has to do with how the human psyche operates, because buildings and how they are constructed also affect how we relate to the building, how we behave in a building. So things as the pyramid, the square and compass, now you understand where they are from. They're from ancient Greece. They were transported through the Roman world all throughout time onto us. And here's another thing. If you want to know, for example, if a news story on the media is a hoax or whether it's a fabrication, use Pythagorean numerology upon the names. Because if the value of the numbers come down to a certain magical number, what I mean by the magical number is a number that's high in Pythagorean magic, then you know that there's something wrong with that report. Then you know that it's either a hoax or it's just a fabricated story to cover up something else. That's how they operate in the occult. And this is not only from Pythagoras. Everywhere in the occult, they operate through symbols, codes, numbers, and through repetition, especially mathematical repetition, and to colors, because at least in Pythagorean magic, colors also have a certain number as a value. With him, it's all about numbers. And so it is with many of the churches today, because many of the churches today, they base their model for church service based upon Pythagorean magic and not upon scripture. With this, I'm going to end this presentation. I made this to inform you how the world you're living in is constructed, how it has developed, so that you are alert what you're dealing with. That being said, be at peace.